If you want to create a very popular podcast, I want you to listen to the steps I will be giving you into this conversation. This is really important because the last thing you want is to have a low level podcast. Okay. So step number one, you need to invest in decent equipment. I'm not asking you to spend thousands of dollars. I'm not asking you to spend $1,000, but I'm telling you, do not be a cheap ass. Don't actually say, you know what, I'm just going to invest $50 or whatever. No. You need to invest in two things. You got to have the technology when it comes to recording equipment or software. You also got to think about audio quality. If you have poor, crappy audio quality, you're not going to be successful. Okay. So this is really important. When we talk about podcasts, I want you to really understand one thing. We are having a form of entertainment. People are actually tuning into podcasts to entertain themselves. Now, having said that, you have a few podcasts here and there where people are trying to educate themselves. They're trying to gain education. That's true. But overall, by and large, when you think about podcasts, folks just want to listen to a good conversation, learn something here and there, but more to be entertained. So if you have poor quality, you're not going to make it. Okay. So having a decent microphone, a headset, and some basic audio editing software can actually make a huge difference in how your podcast audio sounds. This is really important. Okay. And sounding like a true professional can make all the difference when it comes to whether or not you will be successful in your new career as a podcaster. So the initial investment is relatively small compared to the potential gains, which makes it a no-brainer. I'm talking about $300, $400, okay? But you got to invest in, and you have to make that investment. By the way, welcome back to the show. I really appreciate having you here as we have this sort of conversations about podcasting and how to actually have a very successful podcast career. Now, the second thing we want to do here, you need to choose the right theme. The theme of your podcast will play a huge role in determining its success. Okay, I'm not saying you should choose a topic you believe will capture a large audience. What I'm saying is that you have to sound genuine. You have to pick a theme you can commit to for the long haul. It's really important. The thing is, if you're not passionate about what you're talking about, I guarantee you, the public, the listeners, they will find out, they will know, and people will just tune off because nobody wants to listen to somebody spout out amateurish nonsense on a topic they clearly have no idea about or they clearly are not interested in. So please pick a topic you're really passionate about and you want to commit yourself. See, what we tell our business clients is that if you want to launch a podcast, if you want to have a podcast career, I want you to commit to at least 100 podcast episodes. 100. Very important. The third thing I want you to do here is I want you to come up with quality podcasts, boss. I mean, this is really important. I mean, we're not talking about perfect podcasts, but we're talking about quality. You need to improve your podcast every single time. So every episode, I want you to add something. Okay. Is it the voice, the tone? Is it the quality of the question? Is it the content? Is it maybe the timing? It's really important to always look at a constellation of factors and always improve the quality of your podcast. I'm not saying things will be perfect right away. When you start, you'll be spending like so much time. But see, that's important because, you learn the ropes of the trade. I mean, think about it. Joe Rogan, obviously the most famous podcaster of this era, was not a podcasting expert when he started the Joe Rogan Experience a decade ago, right? He made a lot of mistakes, but he just kept at it. You have to keep at it. Don't drop the ball. Do not drop the ball, boss. By the way, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to create an insanely successful podcast. Okay. Now, the next thing I want you to do here is to find the balance. It's important to understand that when you actually start your podcast, you want to actually test the waters here. You want to actually go with 3 or 4 or 5 topics that you talk about. But at some point, you need to find the balance, meaning you need to actually narrow down the list of topics you're covering. All right? It's important because now that you have found your niche, you need to understand that you should be more flexible. The thing here is that you'll be getting feedback from the audience too, because some listeners may want you to change the format and others will have requests for special guests. So while it's always wise to hear out your audience, It's also important to stay true to your podcast identity. Okay, what I'm trying to say here is that don't you try to really want to please every single request from the audience. Okay, you need to find the right balance here. And also, one thing I need to say here is that it's important to understand that this is a long-term game. If you remember, just a few minutes ago, I told you that you want to commit to at least 100 episodes. Okay, so you are in this thing for a long time. So 100 episodes, that's 2 years. 2 years. If you actually have a podcast every week, which you should to start with, unless you want to produce a daily podcast or 2 or 3 times a week, you have 2 years. Okay, 2 years. Very, very important. One thing I want you to do here is to think about organic search. I mean, we live in a world right now where you can't just ignore search engines, right? So you want to make your podcast SEO friendly, search engine optimization friendly. I mean, there are a lot of places on the internet that can actually help you out. You can actually even hire an SEO agency to kind of help you out. But it's important because, see, the thing is, when you have your podcast, you're going to have the podcast hosting platform. This could be Apple Podcasts, it could be YouTube, this could be Spotify or whatever it is. But you got to have other avenues, other ways to attract organic search. It has to be organic. Okay, nothing actually. You don't have to do any PPC campaign. You don't have to pay. You don't have to do any SEM campaign, search engine marketing. No. You want to do things organically. So you want to really work on that. And again, when we talk about the SEO friendly, you have to think about SEO when you research the ideas, the podcast ideas, when you brainstorm about the ideas, you need to think about keyword at that time. By the way, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about how to create an insanely successful podcast. Very important. So number 5, make your podcast SEO friendly. Number 6, you want to get great guests and be a great guest yourself. This is where we love podcasts because it's kind of similar to blogging. If you want to grow your blog, you need to be a guest blogger, and you also need to invite great bloggers. Okay. One thing I want to say here is that it really depends on. I mean, when you start, nobody knows you, and it will be very difficult to actually attract great guests. But once you're known and people start noticing you, you're going to see that people will actually have they'll email you, they'll text you right away, they'll contact you right away from the platform where your podcast is located. So this is kind of cool. The thing I want to say here is, at this point, you want to be really open. Don't actually judge. Don't filter out certain people, whatever, because you don't like them, whatever. No. It's important to take everything literally, and actually let the universe, quote unquote, the universe, show you which one is good for you. By the universe, I mean your gut feeling. So you will know whether or not you are attracting good guests, or even you are invited onto other platforms also. The next thing I want you to do, boss, if you really are trying to create an insanely successful podcast, is to be consistent. I mean, this is crazy. Like everything in life, consistency is key when it comes to having a successful podcast. Okay, you want to find a schedule you can commit to, and please commit to it fully. Because the thing is, your listeners want to know they can rely and depend on you to come out with a podcast on a regular basis. You are in a relationship. Think about it. You are in a relationship with your audience, and they need to know you can be counted on. So by giving them a sense of security that you are there for them, you can begin to build loyalty with your listeners. Okay. And nothing will lose your listeners faster than a sporadic and inconsistent podcasting schedule. This is kind of similar to if you're familiar with YouTube, the video platform. You got to be consistent. You got to come out at a specific time so that you create this sort of a trust, okay, and reliability, dependability. And so if you do that, you are able to be part of your listeners' lives and their routines. Okay. You also want to be something they can look forward to in their commute or alone time. Let me quickly give you an overview here, because we talked about podcasts, but I just realized that, some of our listeners and viewers have no idea what a podcast really is. Okay, let's just go back to the origins real quick for 30 seconds. What is a podcast? So at its most basic, A podcast is a digital audio program or recording similar to a radio or television show that can be downloaded from the internet or made available to and accessed from various mobile devices. As with most media in the digital age, the format, structure, and content of a podcast often resemble those of an older analog medium, the broadcast radio program. So podcasts like radio are often created serially and post new episodes regularly. Okay, so there are important distinctions though. For starters, the notion of time is different for a podcast. Each listener is in control of when and on which device to listen to a podcast, as opposed to radio and television, which run shows at specific times. Also, you can make your podcast episodes any length you want, 5 minutes or 5 hours. As a podcaster, you are in control. Okay, so this is really important to really remember that. And several online media formats that feature audio resemble one another, but they're not all technically podcasts. So you have a video podcast, sometimes called a vidcast, is similar to a podcast but includes a visual component, which might be a slideshow or of still images or actual video. You also have a webcast, you have a vlog also, or a video blog. So you have a constellation of formats out there. Let me give you a bonus here. If you have made it so far, I really want to reward you, and I want to dig a little deeper into the whole conversation here. One thing you need to understand here is that when we talk about podcasts, there are several formats and types. So you're able to actually choose the one that works for you. That actually fits with your schedule here and with your personality also. Okay, there are a number of formats you can choose for your podcast. So you need to consider which type is best for presenting your content, and it can be an interview. So an interview is the most common format. So it most often features, I would say, one host who introduces and interviews guests. And an offshoot of this type is a panel discussion, or let's say roundtable format, with a host who leads the conversation. So that's number one. So you have an interview. You also have a monologue. So a monologue is a commentary style podcast built around one personality, which gives the show one voice or a single point of view. Okay, and so this actually this is kind of important. But hey, listen, there are viewers, there are listeners who love this sort of format also. You also have a multiple host format. So the podcast is divided up between several different people, or two or more co-hosts share actually the lead of the show. Okay, so this is important. You also have a narrative or storytelling style of podcast focuses on how the content is presented. In many ways, this type has fueled the popularity of podcasting recently. Okay, so this is it is what it is. So here you have it. You have various formats here. Now the thing is that you have to ask yourself, which one is good for me? So there are 3 questions I want you to ask yourself right now. So in choosing the format, the podcast format and type that you need, whether you need an interview, a monologue, a multiple host format, or a narrative, you got to ask yourself 3 questions. Number one, very important. What is my podcast theme? What is the topic? What am I talking about? Very important. Number 2, what would actually fit my own personality? Am I someone who's more like I would say I don't know how to say, like very analytical? Like I would rather go with a narrative, or I like to ask questions. So the interview format will be better for me. So ask yourself that. Number 3, what would resonate with your audience? See, the thing is, you're doing everything for your audience. You're doing everything for your listeners. I mean, if they don't like your format, you're out of business, right? So you have to constantly get the feedback. It has to be a feedback loop that actually talks about what you need. So the proper format is the intersection of those 3 things: the theme, your own personality, and what your audience is looking for. So this is really important. Let me give you a few pro tips here. Okay, it's really important to understand that what you need, if you want to succeed as a podcaster, you have to invest in 3 things. You have to invest in people, you You have to invest in hardware. And you have to invest in software technology. Three things. You can see that there's a trifecta in everything I'm telling you here. In people, this could be yourself first. You want to start with yourself, be healthy. You want to have a healthy lifestyle. If you have a team around you, if you have a podcast team, then you need to invest in those people too, in terms of training, in terms of higher compensation. Also, if you have the resources for it. Okay. Now, in terms of hardware, you have to think about everything from audio to audio, like microphone, to the sound system and whatnot. Okay. Now, in terms of technology, software, you have to think about audio editing software. Okay. Because it's really important to understand that technology will dramatically change the way your specific podcast is developed, produced, and publicized. Okay. And so additionally, laptops, desktops, tablets, phones, and other devices are equipped nowadays. And this is kind of cool. This is a very good development. They are equipped with more powerful processors and other features that make creating podcasts very easy. There are even new, inexpensive ways to make sure your environment helps you attain the best quality audio. Okay. It's really important. So hardware, software, the people, but also I want you to think about your budget, because your budget will be the biggest factor in determining what equipment you buy. And if you remember, when I started this conversation, I said you don't have to spend a ton of cash to acquire what you need to acquire. However, again, I'm just telling you, don't be a cheap ass. Okay. It's important that you actually invest in your own career as a podcaster, so you get the best of the best if possible. It's really important to understand that you can also record your podcast properly on your computer, but the thing is, you will need audio editing or DAW, digital audio workstation software. Okay. And and this can cost somewhere from $100 to $600. Okay. And so if you were to go with Adobe Audition, you would need a subscription, which can cost like $20 to $30 actually, okay, a month. Okay. But so you do have a constellation of needs here, but it's important to actually start little. You want to start little and then you grow from there. You want to scale when it's needed. Okay. We work with clients, with business clients who spend $1,000 to $2,000 a month just on podcast equipment. We have clients who spend like $500 a month on the podcast software. So it is totally possible. It depends on what you're trying to get here. Let me talk to you about the approach that you really need to think about as you're trying to create a successful podcast. And this is something I've said this before. This is for the long haul. We're not sitting here telling you that you will find success overnight. I've made it clear from the get-go that, hey, listen, you need to actually commit to 100 podcasts. 100. What will happen here is your first 2 or 3 podcasts, your first 10 podcasts will not be good. I don't care unless you really have some experience in the field. Maybe you're a speaker, or maybe you have some kind of media experience. You are some kind of motivational speaker. You have some experience. But if you don't, you are going to learn a very painful trial and error process. It is what it is. Everybody goes through it. Okay, very important to remember that. So it doesn't mean you're bad. It just means that you are actually going through a steep learning curve. That's what the name implies. Okay, so 100 podcasts. That's what I want you to commit to. You need to understand. There's no great time. There's no best time to start podcasting than today. Okay, but you need to realize that the landscape is very competitive. No matter how niche. No matter how the niche that no matter how much compelling you think the niche is, podcasts take a lot of time and efforts. So don't be discouraged if you have created your dream podcast, but no one is listening yet. There are many things to learn, and most of those lessons come through trial and error. Okay, so one thing I want to say here is that in 2021, Apple created a new website, Apple Podcasts for Creators, which can help creators learn more about podcasting, stay informed about the latest news and features, and explore in-depth guides for, when it comes to getting best practices. So those who use Apple's podcast app can log in on the website and access the Apple Podcast Connect dashboard, which can also be redesigned. Okay, which was also redesigned with new features that make it easier to manage shows on Apple Podcasts. Okay, one thing I want to say here is that if you want to stay inspired on your podcast journey. Keep your podcast focused. So the niche, it's important to actually have that niche sort of focus. You want to picture your target audience, have your persona, your listener persona. You need to create that persona in your mind, imagine that persona and stick to it. You need to be consistent. Okay. If you want to be taken seriously, post episodes of your podcast regularly and consistently. You want to plan your workflow. Very important to have a workflow plan. Okay. You want to use music segments that don't infringe on copyrights. Very important. There are platforms such as Artlist, such as you have Storyblocks. You have also Envato Markets that actually offer you copyrights free music. And you want to promote your podcast. Very important to constantly promote your podcast. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I was just talking to you about how to create an insanely successful podcast. Okay. And so here are the steps I really want you to do. I want you to take right now, invest in decent equipment, choose the right theme, the right topic, come out with quality podcasts, find the balance, make your podcast SEO friendly, get great guests and be a great guest yourself, be consistent. Okay. And then I explained to you in the overview what a podcast really is, the formats and types you need to really stick to. Okay, what you need in terms of equipment, in terms of investment in people, in terms of software also. And I just finished this conversation by explaining to you. I gave you a few tips for creating successful podcasts. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. God bless you. I will see you next time. But until then, remember, stay marvelous.